Good evening, everybody. I'm Carl Johnson, and I am the director for the C.S. Lewis Institute here in Chicago. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the C.S. Lewis Institute Chicago and the C.S. Lewis Institute Atlanta, with whom we're partnering for this event, to an evening with Dr. Chris Armstrong, where we're going to examine medieval wisdom for modern Christians by taking a look at C.S. Lewis and his work. Before we get started, I would like to invite you to consider the C.S. Lewis Fellows Program. Those of you who have been tracking with us for a while now know that every year we offer a one-year discipleship program that's designed not to make more fans of C.S. Lewis, but to make more people like C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a man who his aide, Walter Hooper, had described as the most thoroughly converted man he ever knew. And so our motto, you may have seen on many of our branding and logos, is that we like to use the term discipleship of heart and mind. And the Fellows Program is our flagship effort to promote discipleship of heart and mind. But we thought we'd share a little bit of testimonial for you tonight, because we're going to be taking applications here soon.
My life has completely 100% changed. I thought I loved Christ, and I did. But after the program, I learned how to love people through Christ.
I think I'm most grateful for the relationships I've developed, with the people who were part of the program. We formed friendships that I think are there for life. So I think is the thing I'm most grateful for.
One of the values is this is different than Bible studies that we have all gone through our churches or through other organizations or groups. This is a deep dive into so many areas that, quite frankly, we on our own don't take time to think about.
That's how my life changed. All of a sudden, Christianity came back to me. It wasn't, because churches teach you what you can do for others, always what you can do for others, but they forget the condition of the heart of the people that are sitting in those pews. And I was neglecting my heart. And this program literally taught me, no more neglect. Now you have to really look at this heart and please.
Even though along the way, there were lots of times where I thought, Lord, why are you calling me to this assignment? Because this is too much. But then it turned out to be the best decision, one of the best decisions of my entire life.
I've realized that I need to listen more and speak less. And that's been a huge realization, and also to think more of other people. Try and realize, how can I serve the other person? That I think has been a big change.
It was really a community and a family that helped when it was really hard to stay the course. And I'd say that I got to the end of it kind of in shock. I can't believe I did this. I can't believe it. It was as great a feeling as when I graduated from college even.
I've realized that I need to spend more time in both the Word and on my knees. So that has changed since the Fellows Program. I never did that 2 years ago.
I changed. I truly changed as a result of learning what I did for those 2 years in this program.
You'll discover things about yourself that you never imagined that will increase your love for God, which will increase your love for every person you see and meet, on how to live an abundant life rooted in love and overflowing love. So if that's your aspiration, the Fellows Program is definitely for you.
We invite you to consider the Fellows Program. It is a life-changing event. Sorry, I had the video going to back up. I can only speak from personal experience. I'm in the role that I'm in now because I did the Fellows Program 15 years ago, and it changed my life. And I, for the first time, as Junie said in the end of that video, I tasted what true discipleship can look like in day-to-day living. And it is in a community of loving, committed fellow followers of Jesus Christ in a good structured program, walking you through the elements of the Christian life to understand the Word of God better, to pursue Christ with all of your heart and all of your mind in a covenantal community. It is a life-changing event, and it is why I'm in my second career now. So we invite you. There's information at the bottom of the screen right now, and we would love to have you consider that. So without further ado, let's get into the night's event. I'm going to let Dr. Chris Armstrong say a little bit more about himself, but I'm excited to have him. He's in the Chicagoland area. He lives in Wisconsin now, but I got to know him probably 8 or 10 years ago when he was working at Wheaton College, and he was the founding director of Opus, The Art of Work, from 2014 to 2018. And I was drawn to not only his great personality and his friendship, but to his work and his scholarship. Chris isn't only what I think is a top-rate scholar, but he has a real passion for helping people grow in very practical ways. And as a result, we've had him teach here for the C.S. Lewis Institute, the Chicagoland area, several times. And when my counterparts in Atlanta, Bill and Ashley, were discussing where we should go next, one of the first people that came to mind was Chris and his book, which this evening's event is basically based on. So, Chris, welcome to the live stream. We're so grateful to have you. Can you
Thanks so much,
tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
I'd be happy to. And also just to say I'm delighted to be here. I wish I could see all of you. It would be more incarnational, which might be appropriate to the theme of the talk, as we'll see. But yeah. I know you're out there. Appreciate that you're joining into this, and I have a very high regard. I've been a fan of this of the C.S. Lewis Institute ever since Marjorie Mead of the Marion Wade Center on the Wheaton campus told me, really in glowing terms, about this fellowship and this institute. About the same time I met KJ. Since that time, I've spoken at a number of CSLI fellows programs over the years, including tonight. I'm a trained church historian. I'm a second career academic with grad degrees from Gordon Conwell and Duke. Before grad school, my first career was in business communications, PR and marketing writing, and business journalism. I've also, over the past couple decades, been managing editor first and then senior editor of Christian History magazine, popular magazine for Christian laypeople. And I'm currently editing as well a scholarly journal concerned with Christianity and everyday life called Faith and Flourishing. And I've been involved in the faith and work conversation for the past 14 years, and more on that in a minute. I've had stints, as KJ mentioned, running a faith and vocation center at Wheaton College, and doing more recently faith and work-related faculty development with college and seminary faculty nationwide for a large private foundation in Wisconsin. Right now, I'm mostly filling my time with editing and writing for various clients. My first two books you might have seen up on the screen were Patron Saints for Postmoderns and Medieval Wisdom for Modern Christians. I'm currently working on a new book on the Christian backgrounds of major work sectors: healthcare, higher ed, science and technology, business and commerce, law, politics, the arts. The book is historical, theological, and spiritual. Not just a history, but also a book of inspiration and wisdom for Christians who feel alienated from their work sectors and institutions, who feel like these are secular places that they work in. I think that's about all we need now to get us going. Just to say the talk that you'll hear for the next few minutes comes out of my research for that book, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Christians. And I describe tonight's theme briefly like this. The medieval scholar C.S. Lewis lived a theology and spirituality of ordinary bodily life and work that we miss today. He got it directly from early and medieval Christian traditions. While today many Christians think we can be spiritual and are less sure about how we can act out our faith in everyday life, medieval Christians would have laughed. What can we learn from them? Through Lewis. So that's where we're headed. I'm an evangelical. I still use that word to describe myself. I'll start with a testimony, because that's what we do. I'm an adult convert. I have worked, as you heard, both in the marketplace and in academia, running initiatives on faith and work in various places, working in higher ed, working with foundations. And I got into thinking and writing and administering programs on faith and work for a pretty simple reason. I spent about 2 decades after my conversion at the age of 22 in desperate need of Christian practical wisdom on work. And what I heard instead from my own adopted evangelical church tradition was pretty much crickets. All I found out was that work was kind of irrelevant to who I was as a child of God. There was the sacred over here and the secular over there. And I just need to resign myself to working in the secular space, maybe make enough money to send some back over to the sacred side where the important stuff was happening. After a lot of searching, I concluded that American Christians of my generation, or at least the ones I'd been hanging around, had pretty much given up on finding spiritual meaning in our ordinary material and social lives. We'd stopped looking, I might say, for God in the world because we didn't expect to find him there. We'd bought the lie that there's something called the secular world, void of God's presence, and we'd rested content to leave almost everything in our most basic everyday experiences cut off and stranded from the wisdom of our traditions. In our work, we have few faith-based resources to keep us from becoming what the recent Gallup survey of the American workplace discovered so many Christians have become, either workaholics, idolizing our own accomplishments, or time servers working for the weekend and retirement. So it's about the paycheck, and that's about it. In our play, as well as our work, not much that is distinctively Christian holds us back from becoming the bloated inmates on the by and large Starliner Axiom in the movie Wall-E. Don't know if you saw that years ago. Isolated in our floating pods, passive before our glowing screens, sipping endless high fructose corn syrup beverages through straws. Where do we get wisdom for this life? For my evangelical tribe, we figured we can go straight to God for this sort of wisdom, hearing directly from him, either through our personal popular understanding of Scripture or our direct devotional encounter with God. This is what I call in my book immediatism. Individual reason and individual experience end up often being our final authority, and the church exists to serve only those as putatively they connect us to God. Directly, immediately. And for some, that's enough. On the other hand, many in the old confessional churches, both Protestant and Catholic, seem to rely more, and I speak more cautiously here, as one who has not spent much time in these traditions, on familiar ecclesiastical rituals, patterns of worship, and authorities. But then as modern folk, when push comes to shove, these also seem often to be filtered through individual reason and experience. The philosopher Charles Taylor calls this expressive individualism. And again, for some, that's enough. But this lack of a Christian rudder for the journey of embodied life launched me into the 6-year research project that resulted in the book that we're talking about tonight, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Christians. And I began during that time also to work at the intersection of Christian higher education and the faith and work movement. And all of that whole project, that new work, led me to a very familiar source, at least in evangelical Protestant circles, C.S. Lewis. And then in turn to some of his most important sources, and that's what I'm going to delve into a bit tonight. So, quick straw poll. I wish we were in a room where we could see each other, but maybe just think about these questions and think about what you'd raise your hand for. How many of you have read at least one thing by Lewis? I'm guessing it's probably almost everybody here. Now, if you have read Lewis, I'm going to describe 2 categories of his writings, and after describing both, I'm going to ask you to think about which of those kinds of writings by Lewis you've mostly read and mostly identify him with, okay? So don't decide till you've heard both options. Here they are. First, you've mostly read and appreciated Lewis as an apologist and a popular theologian through books such as Mere Christianity or Miracles or The Problem of Pain. Or, second, you've mostly read and appreciated Lewis as an author of imaginative fiction through books such as the Narnia Chronicles and the so-called Space Trilogy. All right, so number one, apologist and theologian. Number two, fiction writer. Which one have you most encountered and do you most associate Lewis with? Now, maybe a few of you really are having trouble answering this question because you relate to him in both of those ways, or maybe some other way. Or maybe your favorite Lewis book is something like his Screwtape Letters or The Great Divorce, and you're sitting there trying to figure out which category those would fit into. And that's a good question. So finally now, one last question. How many have at some point in your life benefited spiritually from reading Lewis? What I mean is something you've read by him has given you some light on how you can live well in this world, as Colossians 3 says, as unto the Lord. Most places I've spoken, I'll see hands about equally for the two different kinds of writing in terms of people's primary contact with Lewis, and almost everybody raises their hand for that last question. Almost everybody that I speak to around the country will say, I have benefited spiritually from reading Lewis. That's why something like the C.S. Lewis Institute exists. So now I'm going to try to tease out another question behind these first questions, and that is this. Why does Lewis still shape so many modern Christians in this area of living well for God in the world? What does he contribute that goes beyond the ways we usually address our everyday life and work, through a basic Bible study or through a worship experience, and so on, in terms of addressing our life and addressing our work, however it is that we do that? In answer to this, I'm going to start with an ethicist named Gilbert Mailänder, who's written a wonderful book about Lewis. I think it's called A Taste for the Other. And he notices that Lewis wrote not in technical theological language. He wrote in some technical language in his scholarly books, but in most of his writing, he used what Mailänder calls religious language, which he gives a very specific meaning. He says that kind of language draws on plain vernacular terms, everyday speech, occasionally supplemented with more exalted poetic modes of expression. Lewis used this sort of language, Mailänder said, because it's well suited to bringing the exalted things of faith down into the practical everyday business of living our embodied lives. That is, the lives we live, important distinction here, but in both our material bodies and our social bodies, our embodied lives. We're embodied in flesh, we're embodied also in communities, in families, in social bodies. We might say that for Christians, religious language in Mailänder's meetings takes those two sorts of bodies we live in, the material body and the social body, and shows them to us in light of a third sort of body, the body of Christ, the spiritual house built of living stones, the vine in which we abide as branches, both Christ in his person and Christ in the church, which he says is his body. Scripture says the church is the body of Christ. And thus it helps us live our embodied lives in light of the laws and graces that govern that mystical body, that body of Christ. I think most from both traditions I've mentioned, more confessional, more evangelical, would say, however, that it seems just downright hard to live today in every area of our ordinary lives, including our work, in a way that feels connected to the reality of God and the body of Christ in both meanings of that phrase. Something about the modern moment that we're in, or postmodern moment, if you like, whether it's the dominance of scientific reason and individualism, consumerism, the turn to utilitarian and therapeutic solutions for our ills, something seems to be cutting us off from that body. Enter C.S. Lewis. Again, why do so many of us still find this Oxford academic, dead now over half a century, such a life-giving spiritual guide, or to use Mylander's term, such a reliable deployer of religious language to address our everyday, ordinary lives? Well, Lewis once gave his own answer, and you'll forgive me here. I'm going to have a little sip of soda once in a while just to keep my voice going. He was talking to an audience gathered to see him installed as professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University in the 50s. That was his last post that he was served in until his death. And this seems compelling to me. If he had any usefulness today, he told his audience, it was as a sort of, some of you know this talk, it was as a sort of living dinosaur, a man born out of time whose whole vocation was to make alive again to this age the discarded image of the old Christian West. This, I think, comes close to the heart of the matter. Or at least when I came to Lewis with these questions of the embodied life, this is exactly where I found his greatest value. Not as some modern genius, but as a conduit of past wisdom. And I think that was his intention. For Lewis was more than a medieval scholar. He was a medievalist in his imagination, in his intuitions about life, in his practices. And this meant that the well into which he dropped his religious language bucket went all the way down to a time when the very character of, in particular, the Western world, every institution, every custom, every practice that touched human material and social bodies, reinforced their participation in the mystical body of Christ. Imagine that. So let's get to it. Exactly what did Lewis learn from medieval faith and culture, and how can it help us? In his book, The Discarded Image, Lewis shows us the medieval view of the cosmos as a material place, nonetheless charged with the spiritual. Here's a quote. He says the universe is tingling, or for the medieval person, the universe was tingling with anthropomorphic life, dancing, ceremonial, a festival, not a machine. Not like the Newtonian mechanical way of looking at the universe. And thus it was, he said, a world of built-in significance. Lewis shows us this world in his fiction writing, frequently. For example, in his so-called space trilogy. In the first book of the trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, the protagonist, Ransom, peers out of the window of a spaceship to see not the black void of space, but a pulsing, glowing matrix of glory. This matches up with Lewis's description of how the medievals saw their universe, as a place where, quote, each celestial sphere, each planet, each heavenly body is a conscious and intellectual being moved by intellectual love of God. I admit such a view of the world seems alien to us, and Lewis admitted it too in the book, The Discarded Image. Maybe just superstitious, in fact, but there was and is a coherent theologic to this view of the world. I'll try to outline this quickly. First, the medieval person understood, based on the scriptural account of the creation, that the material world is not evil, nor is it, as we moderns are more tempted to believe, spiritually irrelevant, for it was all made by God and it bears his imprint. Second, the medieval person also understood that the material world cannot hold the ultimate end and fulfillment of human life. Where do we find that end and fulfillment? Only, as Augustine and Boethius and all who followed insisted, we can only find that end and fulfillment in God himself. The middle way that medievals hewed between the Gnostic view of material world as evil and the materialistic error about the material world being the ultimate end was that because of God's action in first creating it and then indwelling it and then continuing to love and care for it, the world must be shot through with the truth, goodness, and beauty of the Trinity itself. It must be a place of God's presence and glory for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. Now, there's a theological term for this vibrant medieval understanding of the material world, and that is, this may worry some of you, but I'll unpack it a little bit. The term is sacramentalism. This is a linked set of beliefs. First, that the outward and visible can convey the inward and spiritual. Second, that all creation is in some sense a reflection of the Creator. And thus, third, that God is present in and through every square inch of the world, waiting to be discovered. It's not pantheism. It's the reflection of God's glory and presence. God is not the tree, but God is reflected in the tree and the grass and the woods, the mountains, the wonderful nature that Lewis so loved to go out walking in whenever he got the chance. In Lewis's book, English Literature in the 16th Century, he describes the mindset of a medieval boy, and it was a boy at that time, who starts at school where he learns, quote, farriery, forestry, archery, hawking, sowing, ditching, thatching, brewing, baking, weaving, and practical astronomy. This material, concrete knowledge, Lewis says, mixed with their law, rhetoric, theology, and mythology, bred an outlook very different from our own. High abstractions and rarefied artifices jostled the earthiest particulars. This is the professor speaking. He's using some $50 words here. But they talked more readily, the medieval folks, than we do about large universals such as death, change, fortune, friendship, or salvation. But also, he says, this is a quote from that work, 16th century literature, they also talked about pigs, loaves, boots, and boats. The mind, he said, darted more easily to and fro between that mental heaven and earth. The cloud of middle generalizations hanging between the two was then much smaller. Hence, as it seems to us, both the naivete and the energy of their writing. They talk something like angels and something like sailors and stable boys, never like the civil servants or writers of leading articles. In other words, a sacramental consciousness blanketed every part of the medieval life like a divine canopy. And Lewis himself, in his own religious life, followed this sacramental path, in fact, more and more the longer he lived, absorbing eventually such medieval Catholic practices as going to confession, venerating the elements, fasting, and more. As for modern folks like the civil servants and writers of leading articles who had left the material world behind and turned to a cloud of generalities, Lewis feared, as he wrote in his book, The Abolition of Man, that they were losing, along with the belief in the dignity and wonder of embodied life, they were losing even their own souls. And so he wrote imaginative fiction and popular religious works to address this modern situation. Now let's take a moment to look at Lewis's influences in this enterprise, because he was influenced very significantly by a number of key thinkers and friends. Even at 17 years of age, Lewis had already begun absorbing this medieval focus on the Incarnation, we'll get back to that in a moment, and sacramentalism. That was the year he picked up a book at a train station, at a bookstall, by the Scottish Victorian novelist George MacDonald. MacDonald's surreal and moving fantasy novel Phantastes, Lewis later said, quote, baptized his imagination. It did so by showing him that there was more to the world than meets the eye, though he did not yet associate that more with the Christian God. He was still an atheist at that point, at 17. I saw the bright shadow, he said, coming out of the book into the real world and resting there, transforming all common things, and yet itself unchanged. Now that's no coincidence. MacDonald had come of age as a Christian thinker and storyteller in the mid-1800s, a time when evangelicalism was journeying from an intensive focus on and narrow focus on the substitutionary atonement of Christ to an infatuation, not leaving the atonement behind, but shifting focus to an infatuation with his incarnation, where Christ comes and becomes a human being like you and me. And at the same time, that era, that Victorian era in England, was falling in love with a romanticized idea of the Middle Ages. This was the age of Victoria, which was also, and it still remains in our imaginations, the age of Christmas, the festival of the Incarnation. In reaction to the stern, sin and atonement-focused Calvinism of his father, MacDonald trod the medieval way, placing the Incarnation squarely in the center of his faith. And so, as the medievals also had, he read all of nature and all of human culture through the lens, again, potential ways that the glory of God is reflected to us. Take, for example, the, I would say, almost eccentric attention that MacDonald and his family lavished on Christmas as they staged beautiful tableaux of the Annunciation, the stable, the angels, and the shepherds in their house, and invited all around to come in and see. This is not coincidental. Over 600 years prior to MacDonald's Victorian Christmas tableau, a medieval friar, Francis of Assisi, had created a similar celebration of the birth of the incarnate Christ. This was 1223 in the rural town of Greccio. To the amazement of the townspeople, Francis staged in a cave, complete with ox and ass, the first living nativity. And then he invited all to enter and singing hymns for a celebration of the Mass right there over the manger. No wonder MacDonald received the title St. Francis of Aberdeen from G.K. Chesterton. And no wonder Lewis, who had at 17 been so deeply affected by the sacramental imagination of that modern Francis, later found the original Francis to be, as he said, one of the shining examples of human holiness. All right. From Francis, it's a straight line to the English mystery play or miracle play tradition, which Lewis's friend, the Oxford medievalist Dorothy L. Sayers, picked up and elaborated. These were plays, a whole series of short plays on Christ's life and the whole history of salvation, often performed in town squares on wagons, each scene produced by one of the local craft guilds, thus grounding the sacred drama in the realities of the workaday world. For example, in the crucifixion play from the medieval city of York, which is still put on regularly every 4 years, the Nailers Guild, the carpenters who had the hereditary responsibility for that play about the crucifixion, had the men prepare the cross and pound the nails through Christ's hands and feet, all the while complaining of the difficulty and boredom of the work, oblivious to the divine significance of what they were doing. Let the audience understand. The plays helped their audiences absorb themselves imaginatively in the Incarnation, in the human life of Christ, by marrying the sublime and the crass, heightening the bizarre reality of a God who becomes human and dies at the hands of those he created. Lewis's incarnational appreciation for the earthiness in the medieval mystery plays can be seen in an interview from just a few months before his death. The interviewer asked Lewis how he came by the light touch in his writing, even when dealing with heavy theological themes. Lewis responded, "I was helped in achieving this attitude by my studies of the literary men of the Middle Ages, who were not afraid to combine serious Christian themes with buffoonery. In the same way, the miracle plays of the Middle Ages would deal with a sacred subject such as the Nativity of Christ, yet would combine it with a farce." One of Lewis's favorite modern works was Dorothy Sayers' mystery play-influenced radio series, The Man Born to be King. Writing to Sayers soon after it was published, he confessed to having been moved to tears by its gritty, realistic account of the incarnation, birth, and life of Christ. He then recommended Sayers' I should have said the Annunciation, birth and life of Christ. It's all the Incarnation. But then he recommended Sayers' story repeatedly in letters of spiritual advice to others, saying, quote, "It has edified us in this country more than anything for a long time." And he read it devotionally every year during Holy Week until his death 20 years after its publication. Another incarnational thinker entered Lewis's development in his early years, his early young adulthood. And that was the crusty, conservative Vatican I Roman Catholic J.R.R. Tolkien. Trained in his youth by priests in the old, very medieval traditions of the faith, Tolkien set the stage for Lewis's conversion on a famous walk along a forest path on the grounds of Oxford's Magdalen College on a fall evening in 1931. As the young Catholic and the young atheist ambled together, Tolkien showed Lewis how, while the Gospels had all the qualities of great human storytelling, they in fact portrayed a true event. God the storyteller entered his own story in the flesh and brought a joyous conclusion from a tragic situation. Of course, Tolkien's Roman Catholic training had helped to make him very much an intuitive medievalist himself. He had absorbed the medieval wonder at the amazing fact that God had taken on human flesh. And he had also inherited the medieval sacramental vision of the whole world as a place where God can be met. Not just the bread and wine of the Eucharist, but also in the mountains and the forests, the craftsmanship of men, humans, and elves, and all the great adventures of our lives. Once in a letter to the great British poet W.H. Auden, whom Tolkien had taught, Tolkien describes what he was doing with the characters in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He called them living allegories, saying this, quote, "They embody in a particular tale and clothed in the garments of time and place, universal truth and everlasting life." Later we find Lewis echoing the same sacramental language in a commentary on a poem by another close literary friend of his, Charles Williams. Quote, "Every created thing," says Lewis, "is in its degree an image of God, and the ordinate and faithful appreciation of that thing is a clue which, truly followed, will lead back to him." Lewis believed this sacramental function applied not just to art, but to the most mundane and ordinary parts of our domestic and working lives. One is reminded of Tolkien's hobbits in the Shire, their love of pipes and parties and meals and more meals. There's something precious and indeed godly in our ordinary material and social lives. This is straight-up medieval sacramentalism. Perhaps Lewis's most vivid defense of the sacredness of the everyday against modern philosophical materialism is his third novel in the space trilogy, That Hideous Strength. The villains of the piece are modern technocrats, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, or NICE, they're not, who in a Gnostic quest for pure spirit and under the leadership of a literal brain in a box, try to eliminate the crucial material dimension of what it means to be human, and in fact, all biological life on Earth not far behind. It's all messy, they don't like it. Standing against NICE is a community of ordinary folks at a house called St. Anne's. That was the traditional Catholic name for the Virgin Mary's mother. The community at St. Anne's is a picture of humans as we should be, redeemed and whole. And they're so everyday, so earthy in their routines, their mundane talents, and their ordinary leftover Christian morality. Throughout the story, medieval themes abound, not least an appearance by the wizard Merlin himself. Lewis, drawing from all of these influences, once described the Incarnation as, quote, "heaven drawing earth up into it, taking on with it the whole environment of nature." Jesus took on locality, limitation, sleep, sweat, aching feet, frustration, pain, doubt, and death. Lewis recognized that by not just creating us, but also becoming one of us, Christ ennobled and raised up all of humanity, including our embodiedness, both material and social. Like Francis and the writers of the mystery plays, Lewis grasped the importance of affirming this embodiedness in our relationship with God. In his sermon called Transposition, he argued that this must be so, because we have actually no other way to know this invisible spiritual God than through our bodies. We have no other way to understand him than through the analogy of our sensory experiences. Again, this incarnational principle in Lewis's thought was distinctly medieval. For the Incarnation, as Jaroslav Pelikan, the great historian, has shown, the Incarnation was the focal point of medieval thought and life, joining together the metaphysical and the physical, the heavenly and the mundane, the eternal and the everyday. Especially during the second half of the Middle Ages, from 1000 to 1500, Western art, theology, church life, and private devotion all focused on the Incarnation. The gospel accounts of Jesus' human birth, life, and passion became their canon within the canon of Scripture. The Franciscans spread across Europe, trying to approximate Jesus' own Spartan traveling life on earth. Devotional art and writings dwelt lovingly on his human sufferings. Mystics dreamed dreams and saw visions of him coming to them bodily. Perhaps the most intense and long-lasting dimension of the medieval focus on the Incarnation was that era's devotion to the Passion of Jesus, a devotion that was also a guide to practical life. Especially from about 1100 AD on, preachers encouraged their people to meditate imaginatively on Jesus' compassion, demonstrated supremely on the cross, as a motivation to do what they called the 7 corporal and 7 spiritual acts of mercy. 7 corporal acts were mostly based on the parable of the sheep and the goats. They were feeding people, giving them water, visiting them when they're sick and in prison and so forth. And those were ubiquitous sermon themes during that period. The writing of such devotional writers of the period as Julian of Norwich and her lay friend Marjorie Kemp bring this passion devotion alive to us. Kemp's autobiography, dictated to a priest, she was illiterate herself, shows us an ordinary middle-class woman, the wife of an English town mayor and the mother of many children, who was captivated by the fact that God has really become human and really has been tempted and suffered in all the ways that we have. Marjorie saw in every passing man or child the humanity and thus also the deity of Christ. She wept at Mass, and she sought out and did compassionate acts as Jesus had done. She assumed that Christ was speaking to her in her experiences, and that she, transformed by those experiences, could now act as a better Christian in her everyday life. This was the sort of medieval incarnational piety that affected Lewis deeply. As a young atheist, he had experienced his own long road to faith, as guided by experiences of joy triggered by a variety of natural and artistic stimuli, and so that he went so far as to identify himself as an empirical theist, somebody who came to God through experience, through testing the world to see where it rang true. Now we find ourselves coming back to where we started. Do medieval Christians have anything to say to our material and social lives? I'm tempted to indulge in a bit of sarcasm here. Yeah, maybe. Medieval Christians invented the hospital. They created the breathtaking artistry of the Gothic cathedrals. They pioneered modern Western science through a new institution which they also invented, the university. In other words, you'll find in the Middle Ages the roots of modern healthcare, arts, higher education, science, and more. And each of these areas of medieval material progress was underwritten by this same lively sacramental theology and spirituality that joined the material closely with the spiritual. If I had more time, I could delve a bit further into each of these. We must move on. We can talk about it later in the discussion period, or it's in my book as well. As we close, I want to zero in on a few specific learnings from the medieval wisdom that so sustained Lewis in the specific area of human work. Despite the co-opting of the word vocation for monastic or priestly callings of the particularly late medieval church, medieval faith gives us important theological resources for thinking about ordinary work. As the ancient period closed and the medieval opened, the West's defining theologian, Augustine, distinguished two spheres of human endeavor, the contemplative life and the active life. The contemplative life was prayer, devotion, everything that turned our focus toward God. The active life comprised all the ways that we humans serve one another: farming, crafting, trading, raising families. While Augustine declared both of these to be good, oh, and by the way, also charitable acts like those described in the parable of the sheep and the goats. While Augustine declared both of those to be good, he held the contemplative life in higher regard. But a century or so later, along came the monk Pope Gregory the Great, 6th century, who has been called the spiritual father of the whole medieval period, roughly the 500s through 1500. Unlike Augustine, Gregory did not insist on the supremacy of the contemplative life over the active life, and this was linked to a strong sacramentalism in his thought. For Gregory, God is deeply involved in creation, and if we are attentive and discerning, we can hear him communicate to us through nature as well as culture. And after an initial struggle, he applied this sacramentalism to the working life too. Now, he was a monk before he was pope, and as a monk he had been taught to value the contemplative life more highly than the active life. But as the pope, continually busy with the affairs of the world, he, out of a kind of necessity, came to see those two kinds of life as complementary and necessary parts of the Christian life. Though at times one must remove oneself from the distractions of the working world to pray and contemplate, one must also go out into the world and serve the needs of others. In the active life, the life of ordinary work, we both serve Christ in others, fulfilling the Matthew 25 mandate, that is, the sheep and the goats, and we encounter the fallenness of others and ourselves, which drives us back to prayer. Work is tough. Serving others is tough. We confront sin in ourselves and in other people, and that drives us back to prayer. Work, in other words, becomes for us a sanctifying thing, as iron sharpens iron. Remarkably for his time, Gregory saw those who lived the active life, non-monastics, as better equipped to experience the contemplative life than those who absorbed all their hours in spiritual pursuits. Though he continued to value the monastic life highly, he confessed that a married cleaning woman might well attain to greater spiritual heights than a cloistered monk. One of Gregory's heroes, the monastic pioneer Benedict of Nursia, whose rule became the rule for all of Western monasticism, made manual labor the duty of every monk. Following Gregory, the monastics at their best, following Benedict's, the monastics at their best understood this labor as an essential part of a life lived for God. Like Benedict and Gregory, they saw every part of creation and every sphere of human experience as bearing sacramental significance. And this was very practical. Monastic houses often served guests, and Benedict insisted in the rule that each guest be served as the monks would serve Christ himself. In time, orders of monks or nuns became the custodians of schools, orphanages, hospitals, which grew up within monasticism, and became practitioners and innovators in food production, including brewing and winemaking, which became quite profitable. Indeed, the monastic houses began to shape the whole civilization of the West through ordinary work as well as prayer. Later in the period, the German Dominican friars Meister Eckhart and Johann Tauler, both from the early 14th century, extended this insight, affirming a non-monastic, non-priestly call of God. For them, not just monastics, but ordinary working folk could achieve the highest title of traditional monasticism, friend of God. Centuries before Luther, they revived Gregory's understanding of the symbiotic relationship between action and contemplation, acknowledging that at times external work is more useful to our souls than internal. For example, Eckhart says, if one were in an ecstasy, that is, a contemplative transport, a rapture, even if it were as high as that of Paul, and knew that beside him there was an infirm man who needed a bowl of soup from him, it would be better for him to abandon his ecstasy and serve the needy man. And this isn't just a momentary concession. He also said, "We are brought forth into time in order that our sensible worldly occupations may lead us nearer and make us like unto God." Thus, quote, "one can gather nettles and still stand in union with God." Tauler criticized those who believed that the work of the business person who knows all the secrets of commerce was somehow a spiritual obstacle. He said, "It is certainly not God who has put this obstacle." Rather, he taught the working life of active service in commerce, as in any other sphere, is simply a different way of serving and knowing God. This work, too, is a calling, and the person who obeys it with singleness of purpose is truly on the way to God. And so the door to calling was opened centuries before Luther and his teachings about vocation to the common working person. As we close, let's bring this topic of work back to two medieval-inflected modern voices that we've already heard from. First, briefly, Dorothy Sayers, and then once again, to wrap us up, Lewis. Sayers was highly sensitive to aspects of early 20th century English Christianity that catered to unreality. The evangelical school she'd attended as a girl was marked by a sentimental, moralistic piety that seemed to wallow in reverent unreality. She talked about the hushed tones in which things about Jesus were spoken, and the way in which the Bible seemed like a whole other world, very unrealistic and unworldly to her in the way of separated from reality. In the face of that, the brilliant medievalist, and she was a mystery novelist, a playwright, but also a medieval scholar who translated medieval poetry. She spent much of her career bringing the gospel into effective dialogue with everyday life. As in that play I mentioned, that series of radio plays on Christ. In an essay called "Why Work?", which is still well worth reading, Sayers argues that work should be seen, quote, "not as a necessary drudgery to be undergone for the purpose of making money, but as a way of life in which the nature of man should find its proper exercise and delight, and so fulfill itself to the glory of God." We might say, yeah, but you don't know my job. But at its best, I think she was saying. And she found it natural that humans made in God's image should make things as God makes them for the sake of doing well a thing that is well worth doing. Those are her words. Such a view of work, she argues, will help us to escape from the appalling squirrel cage of economic confusion in which we have been madly turning for the last 3 centuries or so. The cage in which we landed ourselves by acquiescing in a social system based on envy and avarice. In other words, we're not to work simply to amass wealth or consume more and more, but because work is essentially a good and godly thing to do. She suggests, quote, "We should ask of an enterprise not will it pay, but is it good? Of goods not can we induce people to buy them," and she was an advertising writer for a while, "but are they useful things, well made?" In other words, Sayers' approach to work was sacramental and worth hearing again today. Finally, in his letters, you can often find Lewis celebrating the sacred in the materiality of our ordinary lives, even indeed in the most menial sorts of work. In one delightful letter to a woman who has clearly been expressing her discouragement at the drudgery of domestic life, Lewis stands housework on its head with these words: "It is surely in reality the most important work in the world. What do ships, railways, mines, cars, government, etc. exist for, except that people may be fed, warmed, safe in their own homes? As Dr. Johnson said, to be happy at home is the end of all human endeavor. We wage war in order to have peace. We work in order to have leisure. We produce food in order to eat it. So your job is the one for which all others exist." In a wartime talk to a group of Oxford students about the vocation of being a student, Lewis contradicts the modern tendency to dismiss the ordinary. "It is clear," he says, "that Christianity does not exclude any of the ordinary human activities. St. Paul tells people to get on with their jobs." This is in Thessalonians. Christianity does not simply replace our natural life and substitute a new one. It is rather a new organization which exploits to its own supernatural ends these natural materials. All our merely natural activities will be accepted, says Lewis, if they are offered to God, even the humblest, and all of them, even the noblest, will be sinful if they are not. If we come to Lewis on the darker side of work, the sheer struggle of it, the temptations to worship at the altar of material gain, of accruing power and competitive advantage at any cost, we find here, too, wisdom from medieval wells. As a scholar steeped in the characteristic precision of the medieval moral tradition, a tradition that deploys unrelenting precision on every facet of our sinfulness, Lewis addresses just how extraordinary our struggle at work is. A man starts a new job, he writes, with a sense of vocation, and perhaps for the first week still keeps the discharge of the vocation as his end, that is, the ways in which he's serving other people. He takes the pleasures and pains from God's hand as they come. But in the second week, he's beginning to know the ropes, and by the third, he's quarried out of the total job his own plan for himself within that job. And when he can pursue this, he feels he's getting no more than his rights, and when he cannot, that he's being interfered with. When we work, in other words, Lewis is saying, we're thrust into the arena of our own selfishness and sinfulness. How are we to gird our loins for that battle? Just as in the medieval tradition of the 7 sins counterbalanced by the 7 virtues, Lewis took up the tradition of virtue ethics, birthed by Aristotle and Christianized by Thomas Aquinas. In essays like The Abolition of Man and imaginative works like the Screwtape Letters, Lewis showed that the best preparation for the struggles of our everyday lives is a thorough habituation in the virtues, of which many speak directly to the particular temptations of our working lives. In writing of the virtues, Lewis is again writing out of a medieval incarnational sacramental viewpoint. To live the virtues is to embody the truth through one's participation in that mystical body of the incarnate Son himself. And I'll close with this. I realize that's the third time I said I was closing. That's an old preacher's trick. You might be saying to yourself, sure, Lewis was a great teacher, but did he live these virtues? Of course, no one does this perfectly. But let's take the testimony of one who knew Lewis intimately. His stepson, Douglas Gresham, said recently in my hearing that of all the people he'd known, Lewis was the one in whom principle and practice were most closely aligned. He truly lived what he taught. Everyone who knew him saw the fruit of his acquaintance with the Franciscans and the English mystics who sought to imitate Christ's own example of charity. This medievalist who studied so long and indwelt so imaginatively the incarnational piety of the medieval period could not help but put his faith into practice. We see this in his lifelong practice of responding personally to every one of the thousands of letters he received from ordinary folk he had never met, seeking spiritual guidance, though it kept him from many other things that he liked to do better. And we see it in his almost profligate charity. He never turned away a beggar, and in fact he gave away so much of his wealth that he had earned from his popular writings that his friend Barfield, a lawyer, had to take over his financial affairs for him so that he didn't ruin himself. But here I'd like to stop to leave some time for questions and discussion. I hope what we've covered has been enough to convince you that both Lewis and the medieval wisdom from which he learned so much about everyday life and other things are worthy sources in our own modern struggles to live well for God in the world. I've had to leave out much. I welcome you now to delve deeper with me. Thanks for listening.
Fantastic, Chris. Thank you so much. There's, well, like you said, I know you probably had to leave a lot on the proverbial cutting room floor, but there's a lot there. I'm struck what you brought up with Gregory the Great. I'm holding a book. I just finished reading the book of
fantastic.
Pastoral Rule by him, and I didn't know these strands that you brought up with work, and it makes perfect sense in what I'm reading. Just him talking about the role of the pastor, which I think this is probably just as relevant today as then. But it really does make sense, because I think we credit Luther with sort of bringing back work into a sacred sphere and not relegating the secular and the sacred divide. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more. I have so many different directions I would love to go with you on these, but let's kind of focus just on the foundation of this medieval wisdom. You did a really nice job laying down the foundation. I think it's really easy for us just to very kind of in a trite or flippant way say, yeah, Lewis was a medievalist. What does that really mean? So it's good that you did that. But what are some of the things, if you were to put on your Lewis hat, that Lewis, what would he look, if you were looking at society and culture today, particularly in the realm of vocation, what do you think he would critique or put his finger on as potentially a pathological view that we have that we've lost? I'll let you run with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is. I wish I had been able better to give you the texture of that kind of sacramental way of thinking about our bodies and our social bodies, our material and social bodies that Lewis had and that he got from the medieval world. It's tough stuff to talk about because we don't naturally have that kind of view today. It's very hard to maintain that in sort of the modern world. Because why? Because we have those two kind of equal and opposite errors that I mentioned. One being to say, well, I'm spiritual, I go to church, I say my prayers, I do my devotions. That's all about spiritual stuff. The world doesn't have much to do with that. The daily grind, the home life. Now evangelicals are a little better on the home life, but in a lot of ways, this doesn't have to do with our material flourishing or our social flourishing as human beings. That's one error. At an extreme, that can be called the Gnostic error, but the Gnostics actually believed that the body was evil. We don't believe that. We just believe it's spiritually irrelevant. So that's the one error. And Lewis certainly saw it in his own day. And he talked about it. He said, we find it so hard to get back to a spiritual understanding of our material lives. We have completely separated the two. And then the other error, of course, being putting our hope in those things, calling those things our home. The fact that my child goes to a college that will give him the key to get into a kind of middle-class life, which is my goal for my children, that can become a kind of idolatry. And there's many, many others. I'm putting my finger on one that kind of I say ouch to, but there's a lot of them where we and it's weird because we think we're elevating the material life when we do that, but actually we're also devaluing it. Why? Because we're detaching it from God. So we when we make it all about its own self, the car we drive, the house we live in, the jobs that our children get, and so on, we have detached, if we're not careful, we can detach those things from God. And I think Lewis would say, prosperity can be, we see it throughout the scriptures, right? We see it in the book of Joshua. Prosperity can be the thing that really just separates you from God, ultimately. So there's a middle way, as there so often is in this life, between sort of dismissing our material everyday life and overvaluing it. And that's the place where we say, it's good, it comes from God, it reflects God, but it's not the ultimate thing. God is the ultimate thing. So.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions to go in there.
Sure.
Let me remind everybody, if on whatever platform you're viewing this, whether it's YouTube or Facebook, you can type your questions in directly. We've already got one in there. Ask your questions now while we've got them on the hot seat. I want to ask you in one direction. Because I know you have some material on hospitals, and I'm really fascinated by that. But One, I think what you just said, divorcing these things from God, we could say that almost about anything today. Well, I'll put a pause on my other question, but I'd love to hear you expound a little bit more, because I am fascinated by so many of these inventions that did come out of the medieval period. We forget about the university and these things, but could you say a little more about hospitals? I know that's part of some of the things you had on the cutting room floor, and I know you've kind of said there's a bit of a dichotomy, or maybe almost an inherent contradiction in there of I'll stop there. You know what I'm saying?
Well, the scholars I've learned from on this, people like Daryl Amundsen, Gary Ferngren, others who've written about the origins of the hospital as a Christian institution in the West, have taught me a number of things. First of all, it was always about helping the poor sick. Even in the Roman world, even in the pagan world of the Romans, if you had enough money, you could have a personal physician and you were fine. But the institutional hospital was developed, as I mentioned in talking about Benedict and Benedictine monasticism. The purpose was, when people walked into a Benedictine monastery, according to Benedict in his rule, the monks needed to bow down before anybody who walked in, whether it was a beggar, whether it was a nobleman, whoever it was, because they were acknowledging the image of God in that person, the presence of Christ in that person. We see this very strongly in Lewis in his famous sermon, The Weight of Glory, where he says, you have never met a mere mortal, right? There's no such thing as an ordinary human being. And so part of that was that we owe it to these fellow images of God to help them live a good and dignified life as much as possible, that bodily health is a good, that Christ shows that when he comes to earth. What is he doing? He's healing people a lot of the time. Is that just to do signs and miracles? I mean, that's probably part of it, yeah, but it's also because Lewis, in a talk to a group of nuns at an Irish hospital, says, look at the story of Lazarus. What does Jesus do? He weeps. Why does he weep? Because it's a tremendous evil for our bodies to die and to rot. That's like, our bodies are given by God. They're wonderful things. And the Christian tradition, through, you probably know this, most of the folks listening know this, in plagues, in pestilence, in epidemics of the early years of the early church, not always, but many times Christians would be there putting their own health at risk. Why? Because of the Incarnation, because the Incarnation showed that Christ loved us so much that he was willing to become one of us. We cannot overlook those Christs who are around us in the person of other people who are suffering. And that's what the hospital is all about. And yes, it's become secularized now. And I use that term cautiously, recognizing I don't think God is absent anywhere in this world. But in terms of its organization and administration, the hospital has become, on the surface, secularized. But it contains, its history, when you look at it, contains such tremendous theological commitments to what are human beings. And yeah, I just love that section at the end of The Weight of Glory. I mean, it's just, that is Lewis at his medieval best, really.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a shame, as you were saying before, about how, Christians are not Gnostics and we don't think the body is evil. It's a shame. There's a very popular quote, maybe this is a good chance to help debunk it, that Lewis said that you don't have a soul, you are a soul, you have a body. It's not Lewis. It's not anywhere. No. He never said it. It's wrongly attributed to him. I used to remember who actually had said it, but put that out of your mind, because that is such a bad view. We are, I mean, Christ came in the body.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Soapbox over. I have a question from Mark Goldsmith.
Sure.
He asks, if I were to summarize C.S. Lewis, would I be accurate in saying Christianity is used to exploit our natural world to supernatural ends?
Yeah, that was a quote. That's close to the quote I gave you from his talk, Learning in Wartime, to that group of Oxford University students who were trying to figure out why are we here? Why aren't we out at the front? Why are we doing this ordinary stuff of learning Greek verbs and English poetry when we should be out fighting for our country? And what he's saying is the ordinary life, not exploit our natural world. That's a misinterpretation of what Lewis is saying. Our ordinary life, which includes being in the natural world and doing all of the natural things of cooking and raising a family and working and all of those things. I think exploit is the red herring word here, because we do not all of a sudden leave all of that and become super spiritual. We are
Right.
Christian in the midst of that, only we are serving God in the midst of that. That's the Colossians quote again from Colossians 3. We do all things as unto the Lord. So that's what he's saying. I don't think he's making a statement there that we ought to cut all the trees down or something like that.
Okay, well, Bill Smith's got a great question here. He asks,
Sure.
what are some of the limitations of the medieval
Sure.
worldview, or maybe better said, worldviews?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't go to the medieval worldview on sex, for instance. That's probably not, and sexuality. There's
That's
a
good,
reason
yes.
for that. There's a reason for that. Why people like Augustine were so terrified of their. I mean, Augustine had a bad history with this. He was sleeping around and indulging in the sins of the flesh and so on. But it was said he wouldn't even let his own sister in the house. He didn't want any females around. And in part, G.K. Chesterton said, in part, this is because sexuality had become so corrupted and so foul in the Roman culture that was present at the birth of Christianity. If you know a little bit about the kinds of stuff Roman emperors did, the kind of stuff that ordinary Romans did, the pedophilia, the perversion, I mean, it was nasty. And so there's reasons there for saying, for understanding what kind of gets into the bloodstream in the medieval church, and really not just about sex, but in some senses, in some cases, there are some extremes, and this is a limitation, of ascetic practice, of just being so hard on the body. Francis, even though he loved creation, he preached to the birds and the wolves and so on, his personal ascetic practice was so severe, he probably shortened his life by a good 10 years. And that, there's an uncomfortable relationship with the body, and it starts, I think, with sexuality, but it extends beyond that. Other limitations of the medieval worldview, there's always a sneaking suspicion that if you were really a good Christian, you'd go off to a monastery somewhere. Despite the teachings of Gregory the Great, despite those late medieval mystics like Tauler and Eckhart that I quoted in the talk, there's this underlying current of saying, yeah, but if you were a real Christian, you'd be in a monastery, you wouldn't be having sex, you wouldn't eat very much, you'd be hard on yourself. Yeah, that has a good side for us because we don't take the body seriously enough in our spiritual life, and those are all indications of people who really took the body and our life in the body seriously, but sometimes they did it in ways that make me uncomfortable. I don't know. Probably you too.
No, I would agree with you there. I'm doing a fair amount of reading in that genre right now, and I am lamenting at times their call to write off so much, and then there's a little notional, like you're saying, like, but it's okay, the world, but better if you're hiding out from the world and not participating in any sort of pleasure. And I think these things are meant, I'm with you on that.
They're not consistent in their sacramental worldview. They're not consistent in what the incarnation really means. It elevates humanity in these really interesting ways, but they don't always get that. Sometimes it takes the illiterate wife of an English mayor with 14 children to say, God has come into my life and into the lives of the ordinary people all around me, and that's something to be celebrated. I don't have to go to a monastery. I don't have to become a cloistered woman, which was really the only option. If you were a woman and wanted to and had something to say religiously, you'd have to be in a cloister before people would pay attention to you, which is probably one reason Marjorie Kemp's book was lost for centuries. It wasn't found again until the 19th century. So.
Okay, we got another one here.
Oh,
Lewis's view of technology.
that's a good one.
And,
I don't
and
know it
I've automatically
exhaustively.
got lines going to Tolkien's view, as we see clearly in Lord of the Rings and things like that.
Right, Mordor as this place of gears and wheels and horrible technology. Um, uh, well, I do know his view of cars. You remember that? That he thought that cars were terrible because they annihilated space. What he wanted to do was get out and walk in the countryside and interact with the elements there. And you get in a car, your windows are closed, you're not seeing it, it's going by too fast. And so and that wasn't just random. The major industry in the city of Oxford during Lewis's lifetime was automobile making. Dorothy Sayers was a motorcycle rider. Sayers didn't have the same compunctions. Lewis probably thought that was terrible. Technology as a whole, probably the best place you can see this articulated and his theology of this is in the third book of The Abolition of Man. So it's a third essay, the third essay in that short book, The Abolition of Man, where he says that man's power over nature usually just ends up being man's power over other people using nature as an instrument. He was describing, I think, not just technology, but technocracy. The people who have the power, who have the machines, and certainly this is one way of reading the story of the Industrial Revolution, right? Use it to lord it over those who don't, and that ain't good. So if you want to see that articulated really clearly, very thoughtfully, philosophically and theologically, even though he doesn't mention God much in The Abolition of Man, but it really is a theological position, is that we dehumanize other people using technology as an instrument. And governments do that too, and they do it in ways that are just really bad. He was not a big government guy, C.S. Lewis, as you know. So
I wonder if World War I had any effect on him. Related to technology, and I don't know that Lewis ever said anything directly, but I'm struck by the difference in not just technology, but even architecture. And here I'm a little bit influenced by a modern thinker who passed away years ago, Roger Scruton, the call to beauty, even just in architecture, and the ugliness of postmodern architecture. Do you have anything to say? That seems to be a bit related to technology, that there was more of a rootedness in beauty rather than just function. I don't recall Lewis ever addressing that, but I mean, there's a very physical, clear manifestation of different worldviews between the two.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly where he said stuff like this, but he's talking about, a park he enjoyed when he was a kid, and he wishes he could come and take you to see it now because he has experiences of joy, as he describes in his autobiography, from things like the natural surroundings. And he says, but I can't take you there because it's been leveled and made into a parking lot. So that is a loss of beauty and a loss of sacramentally a loss of a potential connection point to God. You can no longer connect to God in the same way there because you don't see that evidence of the beauty of God in that place. It's kind of, as you say, some ugly buildings. By the end of his life, you have the brutalism of the poured concrete and all that nastiness. So,
yeah. Well, we've only got a couple seconds, and Bill's put in a good question. And before we close, what's your favorite C.S. Lewis book? I've got a lot of comments popping up with people citing the Space Trilogy or Abolition of Man. But what's your favorite? What's your favorite Lewis book?
For most of my life, young life, I really only knew his fiction. I haven't come to his nonfiction work until 15-ish years ago. Of his fiction, Perelandra was my favorite. I don't know why. It's almost mystical. Although Narnia has a special place because my parents read it to us at the table, and it just became part of my imagination in ways that it has done for a lot of people. Of his nonfiction, and this is odd because I haven't read a lot of it, Letters to Malcolm really shows him in his last year of life coming back to that sacramental theme of meeting God in the beauty and wonder of the natural and social world.
That's a good one. Well, Chris, thank you for spending time with us this evening. We look forward
Thanks
to
for the
doing more
invitation.
with you in the future. I want to exhort everybody, pick up the book. It's a great read. I was just lamenting beforehand because I was going to hold my copy up, but when I moved back to Chicago a few years ago, I lost three boxes of books on the moves, and apparently his was a casualty.
That's
So
so painful.
that just means I'm going to have to buy another copy. One more sale for
That's
you.
right. Well,
I was disappointed. Anyways, it's a great book, and also you want to make a plug for your Substack. You write some really great stuff in your Substack right now, and you're always posting just some interesting things, and you're traveling to great.
Sure, I'd love to do that. For those of you who read blogs on Substack, I'm an old guy. I barely know what it is, but I'm on there. And mine is called HWOL, which I pronounce as whole. It's related to the book I'm working on, Fully Human. And it stands for Humanism as a Way of Life. And you're immediately going to think humanism, that's an anti-religious thing. But no, I'm talking about a kind of Christian humanism. And another day and another time, I could give you the 10 reasons why I think Lewis is a Christian humanist. There's a plug for you. But yeah, I write almost maybe 2 or 3 times a week. I'm posting stuff on substantial articles on HWOL. So
Thanks. Well, we're going to have more events. We have one coming up soon that's going to be with Dr. Andrew Lazo and Kristen Ditchfield. We're going to do something on Narnia. They're a power dynamic couple that has done a lot on Lewis. If you live in Chicago or Atlanta, you will be familiar with them because we've done some stuff with them in the past. But we're going to have something set up in April soon, so keep an eye out for an advertisement or some piece of spam or social media post like that, and we'll post on that soon. Until then, God bless. And